The Active Directory Administrative Model. Alright people, I gotta tell you, did you ever wish that you could delegate something to somebody else? You see, a couple of years ago I built an addition onto the back of my house for my mom to move in with us because she's getting old and she needs a little bit of help every now and then. So what happened was she used to have a little typewriter that she used to type letters to all of her friends on. Well, that broke. So my sister bought her a computer. This is something that I did not want to do because now anytime she can't figure out something on the computer, she hollers at me to go in there and help her. Guess what, people? For the past 2 days, I've been teaching a 91-year-old lady how to double-click. Yes, this is something I definitely wish I could delegate to somebody else. So it's driving me crazy. As much as I love my mom, she's driving me nuts. Anyway, sometimes we have to have an administrative model where we give things for other people to be able to do. A lot of that has to do with what your organizational structure is. I mean, I guess I could boss my kids around and tell them to go teach grandma how to do that, but that wouldn't go over so well either. But there's probably some organizational structure that you already have, and Microsoft's not trying to tell you how to run your company, but they do want to suggest some things to consider as you decide how to do that. And the reason why all of that's important is because that's going to determine how you set up Active Directory, including how you delegate things. This could have to do with determining who does what, but it could also have to do with actual Active Directory delegation, which is a function that we can do where we give certain users or groups the ability to do something. And that is something that they might not otherwise be able to do. And then we'll also take a look at group strategy. Now, you probably already know about nesting groups and things, but we'll take a quick refresher on that. And I have a new whiteboard here that'll hopefully also shed some light on that. And that'll help us to understand how to administer our groups properly. Then we'll also take a look at compliance auditing, because now in Windows Server 2008, we have a higher level of auditing that takes place, if you want to use it, than what we've had in the past. Alright, as we get started here, let's take a look at what Microsoft defines as an objective in their exam objectives for the 70-624. Under the design, the Active Directory Administrative Model, they say organizational structure as one of the exam objectives. Well, as is the case with some of their other exam objectives, this is very vague. What in the world do they mean by just organizational structure? Well, first of all, is this really a Microsoft topic on its own? You don't really find a whole lot on this by itself, but I can tell you this. Number one, Microsoft is not trying to tell you how to create your org chart. In other words, they're not trying to tell you who should be a manager, who should be a middle manager, who should be a peon, who should work at the help desk, all these kinds of things. They're not really trying to do that. When they do talk about organizational structure, however, the key idea here is that they want you to blend your existing organizational structure, which has probably already been defined, may have been in place for years, but they want you to blend your org structure into whatever Microsoft technology it is that you're trying to use. And of course, in exam objectives that we have here, it's the Enterprise Administrator for Active Directory. So that's mainly the scope that we're looking at, and that's mostly what we're going to be addressing here in this particular nugget. Now then, of course, besides the fact that Microsoft is not trying to tell you how to create your org chart, there are some things that they do recommend that you at least consider in your organization. And this is going to go a long ways towards determining how you structure Active Directory. One of those things is something that we've talked about a couple of times in the past. One of those is autonomy. Now remember, this is the situation where you might be part of a forest. You know, maybe you're one of these child domains down here. And as a domain admin down here, you pretty well have full control over everything in your domain. There's not really a lot that you can't do, in fact. However, this is not totally the same as isolation, because there are enterprise admins up here who, of course, can still make changes in your domain or overrule you in certain ways, or reverse anything that you've decided to do. So it's autonomy in that, yeah, probably 99% of the time you're doing your own thing and nobody else cares. However, you do have authority over you in terms of the enterprise admins, which can make a change. And then there's isolation. Maybe this is not suitable in all cases. Maybe you have certain requirements that specify that you cannot have any higher level of authority than you are, for example. And if that were the case, then we would have to have our own domain, or rather our own forest over here, that these enterprise admins don't have a part of. And then if we still needed to exchange resources, then of course we would establish our trusts, our forest trust, or we could be more granular in that trust in terms of perhaps making it only a one-way trust or something like that as well. So we could do isolation there if we needed to as well. And this again goes into how you structure your Active Directory. And then of course there's things such as security. Now again, here if I need to absolutely make sure that nobody else has authority over my file shares either, for example, then I'll probably need again a totally separate forest here, and that might be a security consideration that would dictate how I structure Active Directory in this organization. There also could be legal things here as well. Maybe it's okay to have another domain over here. Maybe they're subsidiary.company.com or something like that. Well, they need to have their own namespace. So in terms of the organizational considerations, it could be that as long as I can send an email to those people where it's just joe@subsidiary.com instead of joe@subsidiary.company.com, maybe that's an identity that we need to establish, for legal purposes. Or because that's the way the corporation itself is set up, so that when people are corresponding with this branch of my company here, they may not even know that they're really owned by a wholly owned subsidiary of some other company up here or something like this. So there's certain legal requirements there as well. And then, of course, there's politics. There are a lot of times when there's very good reason to have an enterprise admin, which could possibly overrule or change decisions made by domain admins in any of these child domains. But it could be that just because of politics and who's been in the company longest and who has certain kinds of seniority and clout and so forth, that despite the complications that can come up from having your own forest down here, they've decided to go ahead and do that anyway. And they've kind of just built their own organization there. And then, of course, that requires setting up either manual trust relationships or forest trusts, or trying to isolate the scope of exchanging information there. So politics can make things more complicated there, not only on a human level, but also on an Active Directory level. And then there's also the size of the organization to keep in mind as well. So for example, perhaps your organization is small, and Microsoft considers a small organization, but it'd be anything that has 25 to 50 workstations and 3 to 5 servers. Okay, so that's what Microsoft considers small. And of course, these are not hard and fast. These are just generalities to consider there in the size of your organization. I'll talk about how that affects you a little bit more here shortly. A medium organization Microsoft considers to be 50 and 500 workstations and 5 to 50 servers. That's supposed to be a 50, so 50. 5 to 50 servers going on there. A large organization they generally consider to be 500 plus workstations, of course, and of course 50 plus servers. Okay, so that's generally what they consider there. Now, the reason why a small organization, of course, would have different considerations entirely than a large organization is that, first of all, a small organization is much more likely to be in a single site. So they probably don't even have replication concerns. Plus, they'll probably only have maybe a couple of domain controllers at the most. And so they don't really have replication to consider that much, only because there's only 2 participating in it. Whereas something like a medium or a larger organization may have dozens or even hundreds of branch offices that they have to really be careful when it comes to planning their sites and planning their WAN links and the WAN link bandwidth, and considering how much time it might take for changes to fully propagate throughout Active Directory. So all of those kinds of things really affect the design consideration when you consider the size of your organization. Also, for example, with a smaller organization of 25 to 50 workstations and 3 to 5 servers, you probably only have 1 or 2 or maybe just a handful of administrators there. So there's not really a lot of delegation that probably goes on. You may all have equivalent level of privilege. You might all be domain admins, or maybe you got a couple of domain admins and one backup operator, one server operator, or one help desk person. But many cases, like I say, with organizations of this size, whoever's the administrator really wears all the hats. They're both the server administrator, they're also the backup operator, they're also the help desk guy that helps people figure out how to make a new paragraph in Word, all that sort of thing. Whereas with a larger organization, you will have different levels. In fact, at the highest level, you probably have Active Directory architects that just do the design. They probably don't even put their hands on servers all that much. Rarely, if ever, will you see them create a user account, except for for experimental purposes or for testing or something like that. Then you'll have people like your account operators, which are creating the accounts for the new employees and deleting the accounts for the company, the employees that have left the company, and so forth. So just in these kinds of respects as well, it's widely variant in terms of who does what and who's responsible for what. There's no answers that I can tell you that says if you're large, you need to have this many help desk folks and these many enterprise admins and so forth. Other than you want to always keep the prime directive in mind, so to speak, of always least privilege, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later on. But you always want to give people only the bare minimum amount of privilege that they need to be able to perform their jobs. Also, with the smaller organization, you probably don't have that much to think about in terms of group strategy. I mean, I'm sure you probably nest a couple of groups here and there for your users' access and to make things a little bit easier to administer, but you probably don't have a complicated infrastructure with universal groups and nesting global groups inside of universal groups and being very careful about how all of that stuff is managed. You're probably only using, in a single domain local groups or global groups are both pretty much equivalent in a single domain in that kind of a case. So there's really not a lot of complications there, whereas in a large organization, this could get to be extremely difficult to manage and to smartly administer if you get very complicated with it. And we'll talk about that as well here as we go. The size of the organization also goes directly to the delegation that you determine. And I don't mean Active Directory delegation where you right-click on an OU and delegate permission. I'm talking about overall scope here, about management decisions on who gets delegated to do what kinds of things. One of the things to keep in mind, like I mentioned a moment ago, is you must always implement the least privilege. For example, if I've got a domain up here and I've got a branch office down here in a site, it's got a domain controller from this same domain up here. Okay. Now, if I have in this branch office somebody that I want to be able to back up this domain controller at any time, I could make them a backup operator right here in the entire domain. But what that means is they can also back up anything on any server, any file server, any SQL server, any domain controller, anything throughout my entire domain. Okay, that might be over-privileging that user if I really just want them to be able to back up a few files on this small branch office. Okay, so in that case, I wouldn't make them a backup operator because that would be giving them too much privilege. Instead, I might give them a special right here, a user right, to be able to back up files on this one specific server, and that would be it. That would be implementing least privilege without giving them too much privilege to do there. Also, we could use things such as least privilege in things such as file permission as well, and smartly configuring our file permissions. And at this level, of course, we're well familiar with file permissions and what they're used for and things. But again, here we want to make sure that we give people only the least amount of privilege that they need for a certain folder. For example, if somebody just needs to be able to write files to a folder and be able to make modifications to it, then we'd probably give them the change permission, and we would give them the modify NTFS permissions. However, if we gave them full control, that would be over-permissioning that user, because then they could change permissions on that to lock out their rival in the office, or they could add privileges to people that really shouldn't be able to access it. That again would be more privilege than they really need to be able to have, and we can design our file permissions. Another thing that's very important in that, by the way, is properly designing your groups and your group nesting, which again we'll talk about shortly here. Then we also have the services that we need to run. You have to determine certain services that you install. If they're installed by maybe an application, like a backup application that you've implemented, you need to determine whether the service account can run under for example, the system privileges. That's a very, very high level of privilege, and whether or not you trust that application to run at that level. If not, you may need to configure a specific user account, which nobody actually uses to log on. But then again, with those services, those types of services, you might configure a special account just for a given purpose, and it only runs when a certain task runs, for example. It only logs on then. And then, of course, you would have to do other things, such as making sure that whichever account you created for this service has a password that never expires, and that it's also a very strong password for this service. Okay, so these are very important things, because with that kind of a thing, that kind of an account, you wouldn't want someone to easily guess the password and then hack into the service or modify the service and how it runs, for example, and cause other kind of destructive actions. So be very careful about those types of things. Also, you want to see whether certain services are set up to automatically start up when the computer starts up, or whether they're triggered by a specific type of an action. Again, for example, maybe a specific service will only run when your backup application is running. Or on certain protected file servers that are highly controlled, you might not want to give anyone the ability to burn a CD on that file server and potentially run off with company information. So you might disable the services that would allow that to happen. And actually, that would go more towards user rights and physical access, which I'll also cover here shortly. But we also have to carefully protect membership in privileged groups, like your built-in privileged groups. If we take a look at some of those groups, we're not going to run down the whole thing here, but we want to take a look at some of these groups because they're highly privileged accounts. For example, up in here, you'll see the administrator's security group. Well, everybody has an administrator's security group on all the computers, right? So what's this about? Well, in this case, if we look at the membership, the reason why groups such as the enterprise admins and domain admins are so highly privileged is because they're a member of the administrator's security group. So you have to be very careful about the membership in the administrator's security group. And similarly, the backup operators, as I mentioned before, because for most companies, the large portion of their business that makes them run and successful is the data that they have. So you need to be very careful about who is a backup operator. And similarly, other accounts that are highly sensitive could be account operators, because you wouldn't want somebody to be able to change membership so that they grant access to a certain security group that allows them, privilege to a file share to which they're supposed to be locked out or something like this. Server operators also, again, with the server operator, they can fully administer a server, add drivers, they can, install updates, all of those sorts of things. This is very sensitive because they could also be privileged enough to install a virus or a worm or something like that. So again, be careful to check these memberships. And of course, it's not all doom and gloom. You have people that need to be members of these security groups in order to be able to do their jobs. And so you just have to be careful of how you make those memberships work. Also, you need to be careful of things such as user rights. And if we take a look, let me go back to Server Manager here and go down to Features. And I'm going to go in here to Group Policy Management. What I'll very often do in my group policies, and we'll talk more about group policies in another nugget, is I'll very often have an unlinked policy, which is not supposed to be used for anything. It's just there in case I want to explore in group policy to look up a policy of some type, like I'm doing right now. And you can see that as I go down into security settings, that we can go into local policies and user rights. And this is one of those things I was talking about earlier, where we could give someone the ability to burn or not burn files to a CD, for example, which would be located here under the security options. So all these local policies are pretty key there in terms of our security. But for this type of a thing, you can see a lot of different things that we can do here. We can give people the ability to change the system time. That's very important, because if they change it maliciously and make it the wrong time, it could cause tokens to expire or not to be able to be renewed or not to be able to be generated in the first place, because Kerberos depends upon a very, very accurate system time. You have to be careful of other things, such as another good example would be, it's in here somewhere, this last one, take ownership of files or other objects. Wow. I mean, even if you don't have security permissions on a specific folder, for example, or a file, if you have the ability to take ownership, you can do that, and then, now that you own it, you can change the permissions to your own liking. So again, you have to be careful about who has that kind of capability. Now, you might want to actually explicitly grant that to somebody if there's somebody in a branch office where they regularly have, file permission problems or something like that, and you want to have a troubleshooter on site that can always take ownership and change permissions as necessary. Well, that might be a good example of when you would want to grant that kind of a thing. So the user rights, again, are the delegation items, another delegation item, where you can give people the ability to perform certain tasks that you want. Another thing to think about here as well in delegation is physical access. And it almost goes without saying, but it's still important to emphasize that if people have physical access to your servers, then they pretty much have full control, because they can use certain hackers' utilities to be able to crack administrators' passwords if they have local access. They can boot from a CD, a Linux CD, for example, and take ownership of a Windows box. So there's all kinds of things that they can do for that. Now, Microsoft has greatly mitigated the physical access item with things such as read-only domain controllers and server core and BitLocker, which I don't think we've discussed that yet in this series, but BitLocker will encrypt the entire hard drive. So if during the boot up process, if it's not booted a certain way with the exact operating system that Windows is accustomed to and the exact hardware that Windows is accustomed to with BitLocker, then when they try to boot, for example, from a Linux CD and take ownership of that system, it will just be totally encrypted. And guess what? This is tight encryption. People are not going to get into that system. So BitLocker is excellent way of being able to secure physical access, especially to systems that you cannot guarantee, that are only locked behind, a cheap lock with a generic kind of a house key or something like that, or with hollow core doors that someone could just kick in and run off with the servers. On the other hand, for larger organizations that have excellent physical security, you need to make sure that, for example, when a trusted administrator or just decides to leave the company, maybe they got a good job somewhere else, then even if they leave on friendly terms, you need to immediately revoke their ability for physical access. So if they have the knowledge of a keypad number that allows them in, you need to make sure that that is immediately terminated, and so forth. And it's not just because you don't trust that person, but it could be that someone else has a way of finding that out, for example, and then also logging in as that person. And if you just forgot to delete their account for the keypad or something like that, then the longer that it just kind of sits out there, the longer it's exposed to the attack surface for somebody to be able to potentially access. And again, physical access overall, very important for keypad access, biometrics, the magnetic strip on an employee ID card, all those sorts of things. And then, of course, there's Active Directory delegation as well. Now, with Active Directory delegation, I can delegate to a site or a domain or an organizational unit, which you see I've triple underscored because that's normally where you're going to perform your delegation. Now, when you do this, as you're probably well aware of how to delegate, but when you do this, you can choose from some pre-configured delegation options, just checkbox which options you want, or you can do custom delegation by being more specific, and I'll show you how to do that here shortly, just as a quick review for us. And then you can also notice that when you do this, it's going to actually do this. It's going to change your security permissions. Now, let's go ahead and take a look at this, for example. Here I've got Building 1. And maybe I've got a user account here, Building 1 admin. Let's just take that one. And we want that administrator to be able to fully administer maybe the telephone numbers of anybody throughout this entire OU structure. So including Building 1 and any child OUs that are within this. So I could right-click and choose Delegate Control. Then the wizard starts, and as I click on Next and I add that user account, Building 1, Admin 1, like that. Then I could just specify what I want that person to do. Now, here are the pre-configured options that I showed you on the whiteboard. You can create, delete, manage user accounts, and a lot of these others that pretty well explain themselves. But you can see that there's already some kind of pre-configured, pre-built items in here. Now, beneath the scenes, there are several Active Directory permissions that would have to be set to allow in order to allow me to create, delete, and manage user accounts throughout that entire hierarchy. Okay, for example, one of those, in terms of managing user accounts, would be the ability to reset the password. That would be a specific permission on its own that would be lumped together along with several others if I were to checkbox that one item. Now, I can also choose a custom task to delegate, and I could choose only specific types of objects. Maybe I didn't want the person to manage computer objects. Maybe I'm really interested in only the user objects. And then I could allow them to create or delete objects in the folder, but we're going to leave it as it is. And then I could say only specific properties. And as I click on this, notice what happens. Okay, let me clear that again. Over here, look at the size of this scroll bar. Okay, now as I click on it, look what happens. It gets smaller. What that tell you? It adds a lot more items if I choose property specific. And this is what I would do if I needed to be extremely granular in what I wanted people to be able to manage here. And I'm trying to find there it is. Write the telephone number. Now, notice that I don't select read telephone number. Why is that? Well, everyone already has the ability, if they're a member of the domain, to be able to read just about every Active Directory object as it is. So I've already got read access. I just need permission to change the telephone number. That's why I chose to write the telephone number. And now what would happen then is anytime that administrator, that user account right here, Building 1 Admin 01, anytime they were to log on, they could change the telephone number for any of these users or any other users throughout the entire Building 1 hierarchy. And then if we look at the Security tab, notice that there's Building 1 Admin 1, and all that's really happened there, if I click on Advanced, is that they have been given special specific permissions that allow them to do things such as change that telephone number. If you want to look for it, you can browse through the edit button here, and we'll notice that right here it says write telephone number on descendant user objects. Not on computer objects, but only on the user objects. So that's how I can configure delegation. And the wizard, really all it does is it checkboxes this for me and gives me a real easy way to do it. Otherwise, I can just come in here and do this directly. Now then, part of your organizational structure that you've determined, depending again on other things we've looked at, like the size of your organization, whether you want autonomy, isolation, a lot of different kinds of things like that, are going to determine also how you implement your group strategy. Now remember, of course, that groups are for making things easier for the administrator, so that we don't have to assign individual permissions to every individual user on every resource that we have. We just take a bunch of users, throw them in a group, and then whatever permissions that group has, that user also has, as you know. So what we'll do with this is I want to kind of present the nesting of all of these things in a bit of a different way for you here, just so that we can get a little bit of a review with this. Remember, for your group strategy, you're normally going to take your user accounts, and you normally do not apply permissions on things such as file resources and the like directly on an individual user account. I mean, you'll probably do that sometimes, but you try to avoid that when possible. Instead, you take the user accounts and you take the users with the similar level of privilege that they need to have, and you put them inside of global groups. And then, if I want someone to have a series of users or a group of users to have access to a specific folder, for example, I assign permission to only that global group and not to each individual user. This significantly saves me time in administering my resources and in troubleshooting if problems come up later on. Now, of course, if I'm in a single domain, I might just stop there. Users go into global groups, and then I assign permissions to that global group, whether it's printers, file shares, whatever it is. The other thing I could do, though, is I could take the users, put them in the global group, and then I might create multiple global groups for different purposes. And then, if people from all of those global groups have a common purpose, for example, maybe I have sales, marketing, and distribution global groups, but they're all working together on the same project, I might create another global group, called whatever, Project 1, and nest all three of those global groups inside of it. That way, that will significantly simplify my administration. Okay, so the global groups. Now, if I'm in a single domain, I could have also just as easily put all these users into domain local groups, because for practical purposes in a single domain, there's not going to really be that much difference. However, if I'm in a multiple domain environment, then you have to realize a few other things here. So if I've got a domain here, and I've got nuggetlab.com up there, and then west.nuggetlab.com down here, I could create a global group up here. Okay. But where does its membership come from? Its membership can only come from its own domain. All right. However, I can take that global group and I can assign it permissions in this domain from which it was created, or I could use that same global group and use it down here in this other domain. Okay, so it can work in any domain throughout my forest, but it can only have membership from the domain in which it was created. On the other hand, I have domain local groups. Okay, and this is just kind of a review because you probably are somewhat aware of this at this point already. But my domain local group, it can have membership from any other domain if it wants to. Okay, I can put someone else from a different domain in my domain local group, but it can only be used in my own domain. I cannot take this domain local group and use it up here in this parent domain. It won't even see it. It's not even available in the choosing list when I want to choose different groups, for example. So what we normally do then is we take our users, we put them in global groups, just like you see right here, and then we take our global groups, and what we'll normally do then is to take our global groups and nest them inside of domain local groups, and then use the domain local group in whichever domain we are in, and assign whatever permissions to whatever resources we need. And then, of course, I could have other global groups from other, domains in my forest, and nest them all inside of my domain local group. So, my domain local group. So that's how that works. Users go into global groups. Global groups get nested inside of domain local groups. Now, Microsoft recommends that if possible, and it's not always possible, but if you can, stop right there. Okay, right at this hierarchy that we've already addressed. Stop there if it's possible. However, if you need to have universal groups, then you may do a couple of other steps here. Number one, you take your users and put them in global groups, just as we've already discussed. And then you could take the global groups and nest them inside of universal groups. Okay. Now, the universal groups can have membership from any domain, and they can be used in any domain. So they're not limited like domain local groups, which can only stay in its own domain, or global groups, which can only accept members from its own domain. A universal group is kind of just that. It can accept or be used membership from any domain, and it can be used in any domain. The thing is, you also open yourself up to potential replication issues when you start to use universal groups. And so Microsoft recommends that if you can, just go, stop right here at the domain local groups. But if you needed to use universal groups, because you need that kind of flexibility, then you would take your global groups, put them inside of your universal groups, and then you would take your universal groups and nest them inside of your domain local group. So I got my global group, I'm nesting it inside of a universal group, I'm taking my universal group, and I'm nesting it inside of my domain local group, and then I'm assigning permissions to that group. Now that looks a little bit roundabout, and why would we want to do it this way? Well, because number one, we never want to put individual users, in universal groups. Because if I were to do that, every time I were to add one individual user here, it would then trigger replication across my entire forest. Because remember, universal groups can be used throughout the entire forest. So that would trigger possibly frivolous and not necessary replication. Whereas, and let me erase that user up there, if I were to just nest inside of it a global group, then all it knows is that for its membership is that it's got this global group in it. Now I can add or remove users from this global group, and that does not affect the universal group at all. It doesn't even trigger replication or anything. All that does is it changes the membership of the global group. So to review all that again, because I know we got a bunch of lines over there, you take your users, put them in global groups, nest them inside of your domain local groups, and stop there if you can. If you want to use universal groups, after you put your users in your global groups, put the global groups inside of a universal group, and then nest the global groups inside of your domain local groups. And that's a common practice to be used in a larger forested environment. Now let's talk here about something that's pretty cool for Windows Server 2008 relating to our compliance auditing. Now with this one, the thing that's cool about it is that it gives us more granular detail than we had in previous operating systems. So we got much more granular detail now in Windows Server 2008. We can see anytime someone has accessed an Active Directory object. Now in the past, we've also been able to see anytime something has been changed, but you weren't able to necessarily see what was changed. You might see that for example, a group membership had changed, but you don't know what the old group membership was or what the new group membership might be unless you actually went to the user account and looked at it. Now in the event log, it can show you that kind of thing. And then we can also take a look at replication. There's a lot more replication data that can be tracked now in the event log, and all of these auditing items are going to appear in the security event log. Also, the option to turn on this level of compliance auditing is not in a group policy object. Now there is a GPO right here under audit policy, and that one is for audit. There it is, directory service access. And you can, of course, turn that on, but that's not going to be the granular level of access that we're talking about right here, where you want to see something like the old and the new values. For that, you don't have a group policy object that enables this. Instead, you have to use a separate tool called auditpol.exe, and I've made these samples available for you from www.nuggetlab.com. Now, if we take a look at this, I could just even make sure it's a batch file if I want to, but I can use this to identify what is currently audited, okay, and that's auditpol get, and I'm looking for a category, and then directory service access. And then I can also take a look at success or failure for things such as these set subcategories, which are directory service changes or directory service replication. And I can also add another one if I wanted to that would be detailed directory service replication. So there's several different categories you can add into this. And I'm going to kind of just lump all these together here if you'll allow. And I'm going to do a new document here and then paste those in. And I'm going to save this as just a batch file, I think. So we'll save it as a batch file, and I'll just call this Enable AD Audit. Okay, for lack of any better ideas that I have for the time being. So I'll save that, and then what I'll do is I'll rename it to a batch file. So as I go into our existing file right here, wrong place, go right here. Then we'll have our enable ad audit.txt file. Okay, so I'm going to just change that to bat. Okay, are you sure you want to change it? Yes. Now, what I want to also do is to go back to a command prompt and show you that I have to run that from an administrator command prompt. And I'm going to enter in just a manual command so we can see how it's used. Audit Paul, and I want to see what's currently being audited. So I'll do a /get category quotation ds space access, and I have to use the quotes, of course, because there is a space in that. And now we see that the directory service access in general is audited for success, but these other things are not audited at all. So I might want to change that, and I'm going to do that by running my handy little batch file here. So I double click on that. Actually, I'm going to right click on it and run as administrator. And it's going to go ahead and run those. Now you could probably see it briefly, it flashed up there, that all those things were now being added as audit items. And now we can see here that we have success and failure for those things that I specified. Okay? So now we've got just a higher level of access. Now the other thing I want to do, I'm just going to run down here real quick to my security event log. I'm going to clear this just for the time being, only because I want to make it easier to read here as we work with some objects. Now what I want to do here is, maybe I've got a sensitive account here. Maybe it's, let's go up to one of my admin accounts. Maybe it's building 1 admin 02. I have a feeling that someone keeps trying to fiddle around with this account. Maybe it's a privileged account. So I'm going to start to audit this account. I'll go to its properties, and then I'll go to security. And then what I'll do is go to advanced. And now I want to see on the auditing tab anytime someone does something to it. So to do that, I'm just going to click on add, and I could enter in a specific user. If I suspect that one of the other admins keeps changing this group membership and I knew which one, I could enter in their specific username here, but I'm going to leave it general for the time being. Okay, and I'm just going to enter in everyone, and I want to know anytime someone makes a change to, just about anybody, any of the properties, changes any of the properties. If I'm specifically interested in the group membership, then it wouldn't be this right here. It would be, I think it's down here a little bit further. It starts with group, so there it is. Group membership SAM, right? Group membership SAM. If that was really the only thing I was interested in, that would be the only checkbox I'd absolutely have to check. Now, one thing you got to be careful of too is that you don't audit too much. In my case, I'm probably a little bit overkill here, but if I'm suspicious that someone's messing with this account in a general sense, I could leave it that way. And I'm going to click OK. But if it generates too many events, then it could fill the event log and cause other complications, such as, depending upon if your server's set up this way, it could stop running its services, or it could shut down if the event log fills up. So you might not want that either. So you just have to be a little judicious in how much it is that you do wind up editing or auditing. Okay? Alright, so now I've made that change, and now I'm going to go back into the account, and I'm going to change the group membership. You know what, before I do that, let me clear the existing event log just so it's going to be easier to read as we work with this. So I'm going to clear the security event log. That'll make it easier to see the changes that I've made here to building 1 admin 02. So I'm going to go to the member of tab, and I'm going to, oops, they're not even an administrator. I'll add them to the domain admins. Okay, now that's a change to this user account. So this should register in the security event log down here. And we can see an action was performed on an object. And here's what I'm looking for. They were added to a security-enabled global group. So as I look into this thing, I can probably see it right in here. It says that this is the account of the name account. Okay, that's the account we're looking at. And they were added into the domain admins security group. So we were able to get a kind of a granular level of access. And if you wanted even more information, such as the SID of the account and of the user account and the target SID, of course you can see that those things are listed here as well. Under system here we've got a whole bunch of other data, such as the computer that was performed on. So all different kinds of things that you can get into this if you want to get to that level of granular detail. Now then, the other thing I want to do is, if I don't need the auditing anymore, maybe we've resolved whatever the issue was or whatever, and we don't want this high level of auditing because it keeps filling up our security event log, then I just change all of these to disable, as you can see that I'm doing right here. And I'll just do all this manually real quick. And since this is a batch file, All I'll have to do is to run this as an administrator to be able to run all these at once. Now I'm putting a pause in this time. I probably should have done that last time. I'm going to put a pause in this time so that we can actually see this run. And again, I have to do this as an administrator. And now we can see that each one of those was successfully executed. And as another measure, I probably ought to go back up to that user account as well. And just for good measure, I probably ought to go back into the security tab, although it's really going to not really do very much right now because I'm not auditing anyway, but I would probably want to remove that just to keep things clean and predictable. So I'm going to remove that last auditing item that I put in there. All right, folks, I got to wrap this up because I understand that my mother needs me to go back in there now and show her how to print. Okay, well, in this nugget, we took a look at the Active Directory administrative model. And we first of all had take a look at the organizational structure of your company. Now, this does not necessarily mean that Microsoft's trying to tell you how to run your company or develop your org chart. But there are some certain considerations you'll need to keep in mind in order to be able to design that intelligently, such as the level of autonomy or isolation that you need to have, the security requirements, because remember, we looked at in other nuggets as well, that if you, for example, have different password requirements that are pretty broad in scope, you might need to set up a different domain for that, for example. So we took a look at some of those types of things, and then we also took a look at delegation. And this was kind of an overall sense, first of all, where we can delegate the ability for certain people to do things based on their group membership or specific security rights, or we could also use things like Active Directory delegation to give them granular permission over Active Directory objects. Then we took a look at group strategy and administration. Remember, what we do with this is we take user accounts and we put them, generally speaking, into global groups, and then the global groups go into domain local groups. And then if you use universal groups, remember, you usually take those global groups and you put them inside of universal groups and then back into domain local groups. So I know it kind of goes in a big circle there, but look at the chart that I had on that and it might help you out a little bit with that circle of life, so to speak. And then we also took a look at compliance auditing, which, remember, we now have a lot of new features in Windows Server 2008 in terms of the specific level of auditing that it can do, but it has to be turned on from the command line. All right, well, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.